Hello, my name is Ricardo Dolero. I'm a biological anthropology university student, and I want to discover the hidden knowledge of ancient diets. Come along with me to discover the history and the diet of the Kumeyaay. The Kumeyaay were the inhabitants of San Diego and northern Baja California way before the Europeans made contact in 1542. The oldest evidence of the Kumeyaay dates back 10,000 years, but old oral tradition says that the Kumeyaay have been here since the beginning of time. Sadly, as observed with other indigenous cultures, they deteriorate over time. But there are people that are trying to get this ancient knowledge preserved for other generations. Today, we will be talking to experts to learn about the diet of the Kumeyaay, so we can see how it can benefit us and the preservation of the culture. We will also be getting a first-hand look at the evidence that the Kumeyaay left behind. Yeah. It is known that San Diego County is the most ecologically diverse county in all of the United States. So the Kumeyaay had to develop a knowledge about the different environments that they lived in here in San Diego and northern Baja California.
Yeah.
Places like here in Mission Trails were environments that the Kumeyaay inhabited. And we have direct evidence that the Kumeyaay left behind.
Oh, spit.
These imprints in the stone were made by repetitive grinding that were made for grinding things like acorns and pine nuts.
Hey.
Since we must respect these sites, I'm not going to show how the Kumeyaay would grind different types of seeds, but this video is going to show how the Kumeyaay would grind different types of acorns.
Korman hiu ti pei. Kasi kai cái ngoài. Nhàm hiu ai nhào nhung yak hiu ja yum ta hiu. Ya kor nap na chu ya tu mei ta nam ti pul. Ti pul ko I khane fa jo. Ta nam ka khas is.
Here are more of these grinding stones used by the Kumeyaay. It's impressive to think that they used just the grinding of stones to make these deep imprints in the stone, to make their food with acorns and pine nuts. So what can we do to prevent this ancient knowledge from disappearing? I talked to Professor Mike Wilken, a very experienced applied cultural anthropologist that has worked with tribes such as the Kumeyaay in northern Baja California and San Diego. He restores and maintains Kumeyaay knowledge. Let's see what he said. For my first question, it would be, what is the field that you study?
I'm a cultural anthropologist, an applied cultural anthropologist. So my work has been with living cultures, living peoples. And the applied part means that not only do I try to learn from them, but I also try to apply that knowledge in ways that can actually be useful to the people who have this knowledge, and you know, learn from them how I can help, what I can do to help them with the kinds of things they would like help with, assuming they do. So it's a big learning, it's a lot of learning about culture, but also trying to understand how this information can be useful in the world.
That's very interesting. Very interesting.
And since one of my areas of interest is ethnobotany, which is about how people and plants in a given culture interact. So from the time I first started getting to know the Kumeyaay and the Pai and other groups down here in Baja California, they wanted to share with me information about plants that grow in the areas where they live and how they use them for food and medicine, tools, construction materials, ceremony. And so I found very quickly that was very compatible with my interest in native plants and native environments, and you know, learning as much as I could about everything, plants, animals, soils, minerals, climate, everything I could about the place where I live. And so that is a lot of what I focused on, although I've also done a lot of work related to oral tradition and traditional arts of the groups here in Baja California, not just Kumeyaay, but also Pai and Kiliwa. And then also, as part of my applied work, figuring out how to use some of this information for museum exhibits, like the one that you've gone to in Tecate and that hopefully you're going back to. And also listening to the people that I'm been working with. They were very interested in making contact again with their relatives north of the border in Southern California and Arizona. So a lot of that applied work has been helping to organize trips where they can go and do workshops, teaching pottery, basketry, plant knowledge, stories, songs, things like that, that still exist down here to their counterparts north of the border.
Very interesting. That's amazing. You're directly, you know, impacting the community, helping them get back to how, you know, they first, you know, their knowledge, to help them, their knowledge grow again. And so regarding like plant knowledge, diets, since my project is more on the Kumeyaay, my second question would be, what are some of the Kumeyaay's main food resources? And this is prior to the colonization of Southern California.
When you think about the diet of the Kumeyaay that before colonization, the most important thing to really try to wrap your mind around is that they were not agriculturalists just living in one place and raising crops that had been domesticated by humans. We really are trying to understand, we're just beginning to understand how incredibly complex the interactions were between Kumeyaay and their environments. It looks like they were able to interact with and manipulate their environments in ways that helped create a real abundance of foods from a variety of ecosystems that they lived in, from the oceans up to the mountains and down to the deserts. And so rather than clearing land and planting domesticated plants like many agricultural people do, and which has a bad effect on the environment because you're removing things that have been there for thousands or hundreds of thousands of years in some cases, very ancient plant populations. So instead of doing that, they were clever enough and learned enough year after year to learn how to work with these plant populations and make them very productive to produce the kinds of things that foods that the Kumeyaay were interested in eating. And that's a process that took thousands of years, and that's another thing it's hard for us to wrap our minds around. Unlike many of us our ancestors have only been here maybe 100 years to 200 years at the most in this area, their ancestors have been here for thousands of years, and they've been interacting and sort of doing empirical testing of what foods can be eaten or what kind of processing has to be done to make them edible. And so over time, they developed all these ways of using the different resources in their environment. So all of that is to say that there was a really wide variety of foods. Now, in some of the earlier literature, you would find often that people would say, oh, they had an acorn-based economy. In other words, they lived for the acorns and that was about it. While the acorns are definitely an important part of their economy, the more we learn from living peoples who continued to carry on many of these life ways or food ways, as we say, the more we find that there's a great variety of different foods. Many of them aren't going to be available all through the year. They're seasonal, so people had to know the seasons very well. And also some of them are what we call alternate bearing, so they don't bear crops maybe every year, or they don't have a heavy crop. So something like pinyon, which is a hugely important food, the pine nuts, some years there's hardly any, and other years there's a bumper crop. So they had to know how to see the signs in the environment that were going to let them know whether it was worth investing all the time and energy and going, say, up to the pine nuts, the pine nut or the pinyon pine growing areas, or maybe to take an alternate route and go for some other kind of food. And so, for example, one of the things that people haven't paid very much attention to, but that I found is actually a food that I think was much more important than we realize, is the islaya, it's called in Spanish, the holly leaf cherry, which has besides a sort of a cherry outer covering, it also has a nut inside, or a kernel, the inside of the seed, that can be eaten, but it has to be processed by, because it has not arsenic. Oh, now I can't remember what it is, but anyway, it's got a poison in it. It's in my book, that they have to remove. It's water soluble. And so they, like many of these native foods that haven't really been domesticated, like many agricultural plants, they still have chemicals in them that were designed to keep animals from eating them. Now, another thing that, according to anthropologist Florence Schippeck, was an important food were grasses that she believes became extinct because of the cattle being introduced into the area. And so the cattle ate all these grasses the way cattle do once the Spanish brought the cattle in, and they had been extremely important grasses, the seeds of these grasses, she believes, for native people originally. And also there were probably all kinds of other, seeds and leafy greens that people could eat. One of the ones in my book is the bladder pod. It's a flower that can be boiled, or the yucca flowers can also be boiled. They have to be boiled quite a bit and the bad tasting part dumped out because, again, they have these chemicals that are there to keep animals from eating them. So all of those things were things that people could eat, but over time, especially in the last, say, 250 years since colonization began, for several reasons, people's diet changed. So one of those reasons was cattle, as I mentioned, and not just cattle, but goats and sheep, which were drastically impacting the environment. Another thing was their displacement from traditional gathering areas. So people were no longer able to move, say, from the coasts up into the mountains as freely as they had in the past. So fairly early on in the colonization, the Spanish took over the coastal areas and made it harder for native people to gather along the coast. And a lot of that knowledge was not very well known when I went to do my work, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Although some of that has been documented by anthropologists from mid 20th century or even late 19th century. And one article that's I find very interesting is by Jan Timbrook, that's about Chumash Indian burning of the environment. That title's, if you look for Jan Timbrook, which is Timbrok, I believe. She's from Santa Barbara Natural History Museum. She found, based on work of J.P. Harrington, who was a researcher who was working in the early 1900s, that people's diet had changed because the Spanish no longer allowed them to do traditional burning of the environment. And the burning was a huge management tool for the environment. It had all kinds of purposes, and there's a huge literature that as an environmentalist, you'll probably find this very interesting. People noticed that natural burns did certain things to the environment that made it more productive in certain ways. And so they imitated that. And by the time the Spanish came, they described the Indians as constantly burning, but the Spanish didn't understand what they were doing. Well, it turns out we now know that it was a very important tool for managing the environment. And so things like chia, which you probably know of, it's now considered a superfood, are plants that are called fire followers. They're plants that thrive after a fire. And so native people realized that if they burned in the areas where chia likes to grow, that you'd get a much better crop of chia. And so those kinds of foods may have become less important after the Spanish actually outlawed the practice of burning. So as you can see, the way that we understand the native uses today of the environment have come through historical filters. That is, everything that happened from the time the Spanish first set foot on these shores and started colonizing, and then eventually brought with them all kinds of livestock and even things like mustard, which become invasive pests. But some of those, in what we would call invasive today, were grasses and other plants that were brought in as fodder for cattle. So just in, you can imagine how much over the last 250 years, the impact of all that has affected people's diets. So one of the ways that you can learn more, or that scientists are learning more about diets, is through physical anthropology. So trying to look at, do analyses of teeth and bone materials, and even coprolites, which, you know what coprolites are?
No, I'm not sure what that is.
Coprolites are fossilized human turds,
Oh, okay.
human feces, if we want to be more scientific about it.
Yes.
But anyway, coprolite is a fantastic way to know exactly what people are eating because, and believe me, after 1,000 years, they don't smell bad. So scientists can kind of pick them apart and look at them under a microscope and know exactly what people were eating. And I just was seeing an article in, I think it's Science magazine, about coprolites that are being studied in New Mexico, I think it is, and somewhere in northern Mexico, to really see exactly what it was that people were eating. And plants turn out to be very important. We often think of native peoples as basically hunters, and the animal part of their diet was important too, but I'm pretty convinced that the main part of their diet was plant-based. So I know I went off on a long tangent, but I hope that's kind of what you were looking for.
That's really, really helpful. And my next question was going to be about the acorns, because so many people talk about the acorns being such a big part of their economy and their diet. And now that I know that that's not 100% true, that there is more than just the acorns, then that kind of I learned a lot from that. And yeah, definitely. Once the Spanish came, I think a lot of, not just here in the in Southern California, but in a lot of places, and then the mustard plant you see all over the place. That is really something that is still impacting people
Yeah.
today, and the environment. So that was very informative. Thank you.
Good. And I just want to say about the acorns, they definitely are an important part of people's diet. And one of the advantages of acorns is that they can be stored for a long period of time, whereas some foods don't last as long. But the nice thing about the acorns is that they can make granaries, which are usually made out of willow branches and leaves, and also other kinds of baskets or storage containers that would allow people to store, many pounds, if not tons, of the acorn crop from the time of harvest in maybe November, December into the following months. So, and it's also today kind of an important part of people's identity, because it is such an important food. But we also now understand that the diets were much more diverse, and that people were not depending just on one staple food, but on their knowledge of a variety of foods and the ways they could interact with the environment to make it more productive, to provide the kinds of foods that they wanted.
One berry that I've tried out, because I read that the Kumeyaay would use it, the lemonade, sumac.
Yeah.
That actually is really refreshing when
Yeah.
you try it.
Yeah, you can just kind of put those in water and stir them around, and then strain it, and it's a very nice kind of lemony flavor. Add maybe a little sweetener or honey or whatever, and it's delicious.
So I did hear that you mentioned something, about the different seasons. How did the Kumeyaay, live in these different seasons, and how did they manage, being able to sustain themselves, with the changing of the environment?
Sure. So the Kumeyaay during different seasons would follow the different types of plants that were becoming available, that were ripening at different times. And so in general, up in the mountains in winter, it's very cold. So you're much better off to be along the coast in the winter. And then slowly in the springtime, the way it was described to me by some of the elders I worked with, people would start moving up toward the mountains, and you'd start getting lots of greens coming up because of the rain that can start in the winter and go into the spring. And so I think probably people were even just eating leaves they could just pick and eat just like that. We often think of people cooking the way we cook, it has to be boiled or something like that. But I'm sure people knew which things they could just pick and eat. So a few weeks ago, I was in one of the Kumeyaay communities and talking to a lady, and while she was, this was Virginia Melendres from San Jose de la Zorra, and while I was talking, she broke off a piece of a sage, white sage flower stalk that it wasn't flowering yet, it was just starting to come up. And she kept talking, but she peeled it and ate it. And she gave me some. It had the consistency of celery, but tasted a little more sagey. It was delicious. And so things like that, I think, could have been a very important part of the diet during the springtime. Then as you move further inland and as it warms up a little more, there are things like yucca, the chaparral yucca that blooms, and many parts of that plant, the stalk and the flowers, can all be eaten. And then moving further up in the summer, up into the mountains, there are all kinds of different plants up in the mountains that start putting on seeds and can be eaten, like manzanitas, and the hollyleaf cherry that I was talking about comes later in the summer or in the fall. The chia would be also sort of late spring. So kind of depending on what the route they were taking that particular year, they might have all these different things in their diets. Lots of greens, just what the doctor is still recommending today. Grains like chia, fruits from some of these plants like the fruit of the lemonade berry and others for lots of vitamins. And then late summer is when the pine nut harvest starts, and that's up in the mountains. And then after that, they'd probably start coming back down from the mountains in the fall for the acorn harvest, and then come back down to the coast to spend the winter. And one of my Kumeyaay friends said it was nice to bring with you a bunch of acorns that you could then make into a mush to have with shellfish along the coast, because people were collecting a lot of shellfish, abalone and mussels and things like that. And the acorn mush, today people see it and they think of it as being like the mush we know, which would be oatmeal. And yet for them, it was something more like mashed potatoes that you would eat with meat. So if you could have it with shellfish or with rabbit or quail, then that was kind of a really good meal, because you'd have a couple of different things together that people like to have together.
At that reserve, the one in Tecate, we did have a little bit of that acorn mush. And
Good.
it was like sweet and the taste was very watery, but it still had that mush consistency, like
Yeah.
what you're saying. A little bit mashed potato-y, but a little
Yeah.
bit thinner. little bit.
Did they call it atole?
I think so, yes.
Atole, which would mean like a gruel or a mush in Spanish, a thick, more watery thing. Sometimes you'll see the acorn shawi, they call it, more almost like a jello or something. Sometimes it's more something you could look like a brownie and you could pick it up and eat it, but it'd be quivery. It was sort of just depends on how people traditionally like to eat it in that community.
Well, I appreciate all the information that you've given me. My last question would be, how does this information that we're using, that we're learning from the Kumeyaay and their diets, how is that helping us today?
Good. Very good question. So first of all, I would say, how is it actually helpful to the Kumeyaay themselves? And my thought about that is that many Kumeyaay people today who live on these kind of remote rural reservations, their knowledge of the land is one of the things that's helped them to survive into the present. And so this knowledge is really key for the future generations to be able to survive. Often they struggle financially, but if they know how to gather these different things, they can supplement their income and their diets by having these foods. Now, another thing that Gary Nabham, a researcher from Arizona, let's see, from the University of Northern Arizona at Flagstaff, he's done a lot of really great work about how these native diets may be much healthier for people than the diets that we're eating today. And we know that many native folks, as well as non-natives, struggle with obesity and with diabetes and things like that. And so there may be ways that returning to these kinds of diets can actually really improve people's health. And another thing I would say is that it helps us value the native plants in another way. They have this economic value, if you want to put it that way. In other words, they're not just ornamental, but they actually have a use that's been proven over the centuries. And it's one more reason that we should try to preserve the habitats where these kinds of plants live and make it possible for native peoples also to have access to those kinds of habitats where they could gather these foods that are part of their cultural heritage. And I would say also educate non-Indians too, about how to sustainably use these kinds of food resources in ways that could be alternatives, say, to clearing land and planting, say, almonds or something, which are going to take a whole bunch of water and chemicals and fertilizers. There's all kinds of plants that already grow here, and tragically, we keep destroying so much of the habitat where these plants live. So considering that the only long-term sustainable way of life that we really know about in this region is indigenous lifeways, we need to really pay attention to that and not allow all these environments to be destroyed.
Very good. Definitely, why grow these almonds when you can grow acorns and adapt to our environment? Because, like you said, the Kumeyaay have been here for thousands of years.
Yeah.
Why are we switching, with European diets came to here in California, and things kind of went downhill from there. So, definitely learning from what the Kumeyaay did, what native people in this area did, I agree would help the sustainability of the environment, the people, and just making everything a little better and health wise also. So
Hmm.
I appreciate you sharing your knowledge with me. I appreciate it very much. Um, is that a semester at CHAT?
Yep.
There you go.
Do you know about that?
Yes, my dad went to semester 2.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
I did a 5-day trip and gave some lectures, so they gave me this hat. I want to say one last thing before we finish, which is that we can also sort of romanticize the idea about the diet in the past being kind of perfect. And I think in many ways it was a much healthier diet. But also some of the studies that physical anthropologists have done show that because there was a lot of grit in the things people were eating, it really wore down their teeth a lot. And so often people died fairly young, sometimes because of abscesses in their teeth and things like that. So it's important to understand those things, because if we just think everything was perfect and rosy, then it's very easy for someone else to come along and say, hey, that's not true. They also had their challenges too, as far as health. Their lifespan was quite a bit shorter also. I'm not sure in ancient times how much we know about lifespans, and definitely during the mission period, lifespan became much shorter because there were so many epidemics and things like that. But on the other hand, there's many ways that the people here, compared to other hunting and gathering groups around the world, at least according to physical anthropologists or biological anthropologists, as they're called now, have the studies that I've seen from them show that people, in spite of the very dry, arid country here, they seem to have, not been susceptible to long or many people having long-term malnutrition before the colonization. That does definitely start to happen after colonization. So it will be interesting over time as more scientific studies become available to really try to understand the prehistoric diet and also the impacts of the processes of colonization, and then more recent impacts of the globalization and modern diets on native peoples of the region. So there's a lot to study in the field that you're studying right now.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Professor. I appreciate it very much.
Nice to meet you.
Oh, nice to meet you too.